You think you know Carl Jung, the archetypes, the introvert and extrovert types. Maybe you have heard the term collective unconscious floating around in some psychology class or a late-night rabbit hole on the internet. But what you have never heard is what happened inside the skull of a 38-year-old psychiatrist in Küsnacht, Switzerland, on December 12, 1913. The moment he stopped being Sigmund Freud's crown prince. The moment he decided to let himself drop, not metaphorically. Psychologically, he sat at his desk, closed his eyes, and fell through the floor of his own mind into something that would reshape how the humanity understands itself. This is the first 24 hours after Carl Gustav Jung realized the collective unconscious was real. What he saw, what he risked, and why it almost destroyed him. If you value documented psychological history like this, subscribe. It is the best way to support our work. Comment from which city you are hearing this. This script is researched and factual, using sources from Sonu Shamdasani's editorial work on the Red Book published by Norton in 2009, and Jung's own Black Books documentation spanning 1913 to 1932, held in the Philemon Foundation archives. Primary source material. Now back to the information. Let us set the stage. December 1913, Jung is living at 228 Seestrasse in Küsnacht, a town on Lake Zurich. His house cost a fortune. His wife Emma Rauschenbach paid for it with her inheritance from the International Watch Company fortune. Her father died in 1905, leaving her and her sister substantial wealth. Jung and Emma have 4 children by this point. Their fifth, Emma Helene, will not be born until 1914. The house is large. Jung sees patients there. He has a private practice. He also holds a lectureship at the University of Zurich, though he resigned from the Burg Hölzli Psychiatric Hospital in 1909 after 9 years of clinical work with psychotic patients. The man knows madness. He has watched it up close. He has studied schizophrenics and documented their delusions. One patient in particular stayed with him, Emil Schweizer, committed to Burg Hölzli in 1901. Around 1906, Schweizer grabbed Jung by the arm, pointed at the sun, and told him to look with half-closed eyes. The sun had a phallus, Schweizer said. When you move your head, the phallus moves too. That is where the wind comes from. Jung thought the man was rambling. Standard paranoid delusion. 4 years later, Jung read Albrecht Dieterich's translation of the Mithras Liturgy. Published in 1910, there it was, a passage describing a tube hanging from the sun, source of the wind. An ancient religious text. Jung's patient could not have read it. The book did not exist when he had the vision. How did the same image appear in the mind of a schizophrenic in a Swiss asylum and in a 2,000-year-old mystery religion? That question never left him. By December 1913, Jung is in crisis. His professional world has collapsed. His correspondence with Freud ceased earlier that year after 6 years of intense collaboration. Jung had been president of the International Psychoanalytic Association since 1910. Freud called him the Crown Prince, the heir apparent. The Gentile who would carry psychoanalysis into the broader world, away from the anti-Semitic attacks that plagued Freud's Jewish followers in Vienna. But Jung published his book, Wandlungen und Symbole der Libido, in 1912. English title, Psychology of the Unconscious. In it, Jung expanded the concept of libido beyond sexuality. For Freud, libido was exclusively sexual energy. For Jung, libido was psychic energy in general. It could manifest as hunger, power, creativity, spirituality, not just sex. Freud saw this as betrayal. The foundation of psychoanalysis was sexual repression. Change that and you change everything. In January 1913, Freud and Jung agreed to part ways. Jung resigned his lectureship at the University of Zurich the same year. His colleagues in the psychoanalytic movement viewed him as a mystic, a traitor. His book was declared rubbish. The break destroyed Jung emotionally. He later wrote that he felt as if gigantic blocks of stone were tumbling down upon him. He suffered lethargy, fears. His moods threatened to overwhelm him. He could not read professional books for 3 years. He questioned his own sanity and the visions. The visions had started in October 1913. On a train journey, he suddenly saw Europe flooded. A monstrous wave covering the low-lying lands between the North Sea and the Alps. Mountains grew higher to protect Switzerland. In the flood, Jung saw yellow waves, floating rubble of civilization, the drowned bodies of uncounted thousands. Then the sea turned to blood. The vision lasted an hour. 2 weeks later, it returned, more vivid. An inner voice spoke. Look at it well. It is wholly real. You cannot doubt it. Jung thought he was developing psychosis, a specialist in schizophrenia becoming schizophrenic. The irony was not lost on him. He wrote in his memoir that he twice went over all the details of his entire life with particular attention to childhood memories, trying to find some psychic disturbance in himself. He found nothing. The retrospection led only to fresh acknowledgement of his own ignorance. Winter, 1913, brought more disturbing dreams. An Arctic cold wave descending and freezing the land to ice. Jung interpreted these as personal omens. He did not yet realize they might be collective. It would take the outbreak of World War I in August 1914 for him to understand that his unconscious had been sensing something larger. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. December 12th, 1913, Advent season. Jung is sitting at his desk in his study. The house is quiet. He has been thinking about his fears, his sense of impending doom. He has tried to understand what is happening to him using rational methods. They have not worked. Now he decides on what he later called the decisive step. He let himself drop. His own words. Suddenly, it was as though the ground literally gave way beneath my feet and I plunged into the dark depths. He could not fend off a feeling of panic, but abruptly, at not too great a depth, he landed on his feet in a soft, sticky mass. Complete darkness. He felt relief. In the gloom, he saw the entrance to a dark cave. A dwarf stood there, leathery skin, guarding the threshold. Jung squeezed past him. He waded through knee-deep icy water. At the far end of the cave, on a projecting rock, he saw a glowing red crystal. He raised it. Below, through a hole in the ground, he saw a river. A corpse floated by. A young boy with blonde hair, then a gigantic black scarab, then a red newborn sun rising from the depths of the water, nauseating. He wanted to put the crystal back. A thick jet of blood leaped up. He felt sick. Then the vision ended. He opened his eyes. He was back at his desk. His body had not moved. His mind had traveled 1,000 feet down. This was active imagination. Jung did not have the term yet. He would develop it over the next 3 years. The technique of deliberately evoking a fantasy in a waking state and entering into it as if it were real. Not daydreaming, not passive. Active participation. You observe the images that arise from the unconscious. You respond to them, you engage with them, and you observe what they do in response. It is voluntary dissociation, controlled psychosis. Jung was exploring the borderland of madness with full awareness. He later called this period his most difficult experiment. He also wrote that, to the superficial observer, it will appear like madness. The key difference between his experience and actual psychosis was consciousness. He remained aware. He had a foot in both worlds. He had his family, his medical diploma, his address at 228 Seestrasse. These anchored him. But the first descent was only the beginning. Over the following nights, Jung continued the experiments. He imagined digging a hole. He imagined climbing down a steep descent, one shovel of dirt at a time. With each descent, he explored the landscape of his unconscious and met its inhabitants. The second major descent brought him deeper. He estimated a cosmic depth this time, like going to the moon. He saw a crater, a ring chain of mountains. The mood was the land of the hereafter. He felt like one dead. Near the steep slope of a rock, he caught sight of two figures, an old man with a white beard and a beautiful young girl. Jung summoned his courage. He approached them as if they were real people. He listened. The old man said he was Elijah. Jung was shocked. The girl staggered him even more. She called herself Salome. She was blind. What a strange couple, Jung thought. Elijah and Salome. Salome was the woman from the Bible who danced before Herod and demanded the head of John the Baptist. Why was she here with the prophet Elijah? Elijah assured Jung they had belonged together from all eternity. A third figure was with them, a large black serpent that displayed an unmistakable fondness for Jung. He stuck close to Elijah because the prophet seemed the most reasonable. He had clear intelligence. Of Salome, Jung was distinctly suspicious. Elijah and Jung had a long conversation. Jung did not understand it, but something was becoming clear. These figures were not figments of his imagination in the ordinary sense. They had autonomy. They said things Jung had not consciously thought. When Jung protested that they were just symbols, Elijah reproached him. "We are just as real as your fellow men. You solve nothing by calling us symbols." Elijah also told Jung something that shattered his rational worldview. "Your thoughts are just as much outside yourself as trees or animals are outside the body." Jung was stunned. If thoughts did not originate inside the individual mind, if they existed autonomously in some psychic realm that the individual consciousness merely accessed, then everything he had learned about psychology was incomplete. Freud's personal unconscious, the repository of repressed memories and forgotten experiences, was only the first layer. Below it was something deeper, something impersonal, something collective. The serpent was key. Jung recognized it as a typical motif from hero myths. The snake often accompanies the hero as guide or adversary. In world mythology, serpents guard treasures, represent wisdom, symbolize transformation through shedding skin. The black snake with Elijah and Salome was not random. It was archetypal. It belonged to no single culture. It arose from this collective inheritance of humanity. Jung continued to descend. He recorded everything in what would become known as his black books, 6 black leather journals where he documented his experiments in real time. These notebooks were the raw data, unfiltered. No interpretation, just the images and the dialogues as they occurred. December 1913 and into the following year, Jung filled the pages. He was building a case, not for publication, for himself. He needed to understand what was happening and whether it was psychosis or revelation. In the days following December 12th, Jung began to identify patterns. The figures he encountered were not random. They were primordial, universal. Elijah represented forethinking, logos, the masculine principle of reason and prophecy. Salome represented feeling, eros, the feminine principle of pleasure and relatedness. Her blindness symbolized her disconnection from meaning. She was pure desire without sight. Together they formed a pair of opposites, logos and eros, thinking and feeling. The conscious and the unconscious. Jung was not inventing these oppositions. He was observing them manifest spontaneously from his own psyche. And if they manifested from his psyche, then they existed potentially in every psyche. This was the collective unconscious emerging into his awareness, not as an abstract theory, as direct experience. The serpent underwent transformation. In subsequent visions, it coiled around Jung. It squeezed him until blood gushed from his body. His head became that of a lion. Salome looked at him and cried out, "You are Christ." Jung was horrified. He did not want to be Christ. He did not want to identify with a god. That way lay inflation, megalomania, and madness. Yet the vision persisted. The serpent represented the collective unconscious itself, the transforming power that crushes the ego before elevating it. Jung was undergoing a symbolic crucifixion, death and rebirth, the oldest mystery of human religion. He was living the myth in his own body, not reading about it, experiencing it. This is where we need to pause and understand the magnitude of what was occurring. Jung was a trained psychiatrist. He knew the diagnostic criteria for psychosis, loss of reality testing, delusions, hallucinations, disorganized thinking. Yet he was deliberately inducing altered states that mimicked psychosis, while maintaining an observing consciousness that could record and analyze the experience. He was conducting an experiment on himself, using himself as both subject and scientist. The hypothesis was simple. If the same mythological images appear spontaneously in the minds of individuals across cultures and historical periods without any cultural transmission, then there must be an inherited psychic structure that predisposes humans to produce these images. The collective unconscious is not learned. It is inherited. Just as the body has anatomical structures that develop similarly in all humans, the psyche has archetypal structures that manifest similarly in all humans. The evidence was mounting, the solar phallus vision of Emil Schweizer matching the Mithras liturgy. The spontaneous appearance of Elijah, Salome, and the serpent in Jung's own mind matching patterns found in Gnostic texts, in alchemy, in world mythology. These were not coincidences. They were proof of a collective psychic inheritance. Jung was not creating these images. He was encountering them. They existed independently of his personal history. They were not repressed childhood memories. They were primordial images, or Bilden, arising from a layer of the psyche deeper than personal experience. The practical implications were staggering. If the collective unconscious existed, then neurosis was not merely the result of personal trauma and repression. It could also arise from disconnection from the collective psyche. Modern people, Jung theorized, had lost contact with the mythological dimension of their own minds. The spirit of the times, rational scientific materialism, had severed the link to the spirit of the depths. People were living on the surface of their psyches, adapted to external reality but alienated from their inner worlds. The collective unconscious was compensating. It was pushing its contents upward into consciousness, often in disturbing ways. Psychosis, Jung realized, might not always be merely brain malfunction. It might be the breakthrough of collective unconscious material that the conscious mind could not integrate. His schizophrenic patients at Burgholzli were not just sick. They were experiencing mythological realities that their consciousness could not contain. December 1913 was the beginning of what Jung called his confrontation with the unconscious. It would last until approximately 1917, though he continued to work on the material for decades. During this period, his life was double. Outwardly, he maintained his practice. He saw patients. He was a husband and father. He attended professional meetings. On December 12, 1913, just hours after his first major descent, he gave a polished lecture to the Zurich Psychoanalytic Society. Inwardly, he was living in another world. He wrote that he was living in an insane asylum of his own making, walking around with centaurs, nymphs, satyrs, gods and goddesses, as if they were patients, and he was analyzing them. 3 nights after his lecture, back in the depths, he told Elijah that it seems to me as if I were more real here, yet I do not like to be here. He was more real in the underworld than in ordinary life. That is a terrifying admission for a psychiatrist to make. The household at 228 Seestrasse became strained. Emma Jung was deeply concerned. Her husband was spending evenings in his study with the door closed, engaged in inner dialogues, drawing and painting images from his visions, recording everything meticulously. She did not fully understand what he was doing, but she recognized the danger. Jung was walking a razor's edge. One slip and he might not come back. The fears that had plagued him before he began the experiments intensified. He later wrote that he had an unswerving conviction that he was obeying a higher will. He felt not only violent resistance to this, but a distinct fear. He was afraid of losing command of himself and becoming prey to the fantasies. As a psychiatrist, he realized only too well what that would mean: professional ruin, institutionalization, loss of his family. But there was help. Toni Wolff, a former patient who had come to Jung in 1910 after the death of her father. She was 22 then, depressed, from a wealthy Zurich family. Jung analyzed her, and she proved to have exceptional intuitive abilities. Her analysis ended around 1911 or 1912. Then in late 1912, Jung had dreams indicating he needed to re-establish contact with her. He wrote to her in 1913. She became his primary intellectual collaborator. She also became his lover. The affair was openly acknowledged. Emma Jung knew. Wolff became what Jung called his second wife. He had lunch with his family, dinner with Wolff on Wednesdays, and she joined the family for Sunday meals. This arrangement satisfied what Jung termed his polygamous components. Emma was devastated, but acquiesced. She recognized that Toni Wolff served a function for her husband that she could not. Wolff was experiencing a similar stream of images. Jung had infected her, or was the trigger that stirred up her imagination. Their fantasies were in participation, mystique, a common stream, a common task. Toni Wolff became Jung's guide through the collective unconscious. She had gone through her own confrontation during her analysis and understood the terrain. When Jung descended into the depths, Wolff could accompany him. She recognized and identified elements in his visions that he could not see clearly. Analysts who knew both of them later said that without Wolff's help, Jung would undoubtedly not have been able to throw himself into the experience, or might not have come out unscathed. She was his soror mystica, his mystical sister, his anima woman. Lorenz van der Post wrote that in this unfamiliar, terrifying underground of the collective unconscious, she was Jung's guide, like Virgil to Dante. At one point during the process, Wolff became psychically infected. She experienced the same material Jung was encountering. It was absolutely awful, Jung said. She temporarily lost her bearings. But for most of the years between 1913 and 1917, she served as a source of insight and stability. If you value documented psychological history like this, subscribe. It is the best way to support our work. Comment from which city you are hearing this. Now we need to understand what Jung was discovering in those first 24 hours and the days that followed. The figures of Elijah and Salome were not static. They evolved. Elijah gradually transformed into a new figure. Philemon. Jung first encountered Philemon in a dream. There was a blue sky like the sea, covered not by clouds, but by flat brown clods of earth. The clods were breaking apart, and the blue water of the sea was becoming visible between them. But the water was the blue sky. Suddenly from the right, a winged being sailed across the sky, an old man with the horns of a bull. He held a bunch of 4 keys, one of which he clutched as if he were about to open a lock. He had the wings of a kingfisher with its characteristic colors. Jung did not understand the dream image. He painted it to impress it upon his memory. During the days when he was occupied with the painting, he found in his garden by the lake shore a dead kingfisher. Kingfishers are rare in the vicinity of Zurich. Jung had never found a dead one. He never would again. This was synchronicity, a meaningful coincidence, and a causal connecting principle that would become another major concept in Jungian psychology. The inner vision and the outer world corresponded without causal connection. Philemon became Jung's spiritual guru, the wise old man archetype. In his fantasies, Jung held conversations with Philemon. Philemon said things Jung had not consciously thought. Philemon taught Jung that thoughts are not generated by the individual ego. They have their own life. If you should see people in a room, Philemon said, you would not think that you had made those people or that you were responsible for them. Why do you think you make your own thoughts? This was psychic objectivity, the reality of the psyche. The unconscious was not a waste bin for repressed material. It was a living realm populated by autonomous psychic entities. Philemon represented superior insight. He was a force that was not Jung, not the ego, not the personal unconscious. He came from the collective depths. The implications were revolutionary. Traditional psychology located the psyche within the individual. You have your unconscious, I have mine. Freud's model was essentially biological. Repressed instincts, primarily sexual, pushed up from the individual unconscious seeking discharge. Jung was proposing something radically different. The individual psyche was connected to a collective psyche that transcended the individual. Archetypes were universal patterns. The wise old man, the great mother, the hero, the trickster, the shadow, the anima and animus. These were not personal constructs. They were inherited potentials that activate under certain conditions. Every human being has access to the same archetypal patterns because every human being inherits the same psychic structure. December 12th, 1913 was the moment Jung stopped theorizing about this and started experiencing it. He had published hints of these ideas in his 1912 book, but the collective unconscious as a term did not appear in print until 1916, when Jung gave a talk to the Zurich School for Analytical Psychology titled On the Unconscious and Its Contents. The German manuscript for that talk was not found until 1961, after Jung's death. The earliest written appearance of the term collective unconscious was found in the French translation of that talk published in 1916 in the Archives de Psychologie. So between December 1913 and 1916, Jung was living the concept before naming it. He was gathering empirical evidence from his own psyche. The black books were his field notes. The eventual Red Book, which he began transcribing in 1914 with elaborate calligraphy and paintings, was his attempt to give the material artistic and literary form. What did those first 24 hours actually feel like? Jung wrote that the years between 1913 and 1917, when he pursued the inner images, were the most important time of his life. Everything else is to be derived from this. It began at that time, and the later details hardly matter anymore. His entire life consisted in elaborating what had burst forth from the unconscious and flooded him like an enigmatic stream and threatened to break him. That was the stuff and material for more than only one life. Everything later was merely the outer classification, scientific elaboration, and the integration into life. But the numinous beginning which contained everything was then, the numinous beginning, December 1913. A psychiatrist in his late 30s, deliberately surrendering his ego consciousness to explore the autonomous psyche, encountering prophets and dancers and serpents and blood, watching his head transform into a lion, being told he was Christ, receiving instruction from a winged old man with the horns of a bull, painting kingfisher wings while a dead kingfisher appeared in his garden, living simultaneously as doctor, father, husband, and underworld traveler, risking his sanity for knowledge. This was not philosophy. This was not armchair theorizing. This was empirical research conducted on the only laboratory available. The human psyche itself, the collective unconscious, explained what the personal unconscious could not. Why do cultures separated by oceans and millennia produce similar creation myths? Why does the hero journey appear in ancient Greece, medieval Europe, East Asia, and indigenous America? Why do people who have never studied mythology dream of mythological motifs? Why do schizophrenics hallucinate religious visions, matching ancient texts they have never read? Because below the personal unconscious, below the layer of individual repression and forgotten memories, lies a deeper stratum, the collective unconscious, the psychic heritage of humanity, the repository of all human experience accumulated over millions of years of evolution, not as memories, as potentials, as archetypal patterns that activate when triggered by life circumstances. Jung's patient Emil Schweizer saw the solar phallus not because he had read about it. He saw it because his psychotic state opened the floodgates of the collective unconscious, and the archetype emerged into his consciousness without the filters that normal ego functioning would provide. Jung himself saw Elijah and Salome not because he had studied Gnosticism in depth at that point. He saw them because he deliberately lowered his ego defenses and allowed collective contents to manifest. The difference between Schweizer and Jung was consciousness. Schweizer was overwhelmed. Jung observed while participating. He maintained the witness function. That is what saved him. The first 24 hours after realizing the collective unconscious were not triumphant, they were terrifying. Jung wrote that he was living in a constant state of tension. Often he felt as if gigantic blocks of stone were tumbling down upon him. One thunderstorm followed another. He feared psychosis. He feared professional disgrace. He feared losing his family. He feared that his colleagues would declare him mad. And some did. After he broke with Freud, many in the psychoanalytic movement said he was dicing with madness. They admired his courage, but questioned his sanity. Jung continued anyway. He had no choice. The unconscious was demanding to be heard. Ignoring it would have been worse than engaging it. The work of those years would eventually produce the major concepts of analytical psychology, the archetypes, the collective unconscious, the process of individuation, the integration of opposites, active imagination, the persona, the shadow, the anima and animus, the self as the organizing center of the total psyche. All of these concepts trace back to the confrontation with the unconscious that began on December 12th, 1913. Jung derived his theories not from clinical observation of patients alone, but from direct experience of his own psyche. He was patient and analyst simultaneously. He was subject and scientist. He descended into the depths and returned with knowledge that would transform psychotherapy from treatment of the sick into a means for higher development of personality. But in those first 24 hours, none of that was clear. What was clear was the reality of the psychic experience. The figures he encountered were not fantasies in the dismissive sense. They had their own life. They spoke truths he had not known. They challenged his assumptions. They demanded integration. Elijah told him to seek untiringly and above all write exactly what you see. Jung obeyed. He wrote, he drew, he painted, he recorded everything. The black books grew, the visions accumulated, the patterns emerged, and slowly, over years, the theory crystallized. The collective unconscious was not a metaphor. It was a psychic fact, as real as the personal unconscious, as real as consciousness itself. The impact of this realization cannot be overstated. If the collective unconscious exists, then human beings are not isolated psychic units. We are connected at the deepest level of our being. The same archetypal patterns that manifested in ancient Egyptians manifest in modern Americans. The same psychic structures that produced the myths of Greece produce the dreams of a factory worker in Detroit. We inherit not only physical characteristics from our ancestors, but psychic potentials. The body evolves, the psyche evolves too, and it carries forward the experiences of the species in symbolic form. Jung would spend the next 48 years elaborating this insight. He traveled to Africa to study the Elgoni tribe, to New Mexico to study the Pueblo Indians, to India, Tunisia, Egypt. Everywhere he went, he found confirmation. The same archetypes, the same patterns, different cultural clothing, but the same underlying structures. The collective unconscious was universal, not personally acquired, inherited, and its contents, the archetypes, were the forms that all fundamental human experiences take. Birth, death, the mother, the father, the child, the journey, the transformation, the shadow, the light. December 12th, 1913. Carl Gustav Jung let himself drop. He fell through the floor of his conscious mind into the basement of his personal unconscious, and then deeper into the collective basement that all humans share. He met prophets and dancers and serpents. He felt blood gush and his head transform. He spoke with figures who taught him that thoughts are not personal possessions, but autonomous entities. He painted kingfisher wings and found a dead kingfisher in his garden. He risked everything, his sanity, his career, his family, his reputation, and he returned with knowledge that would reshape our understanding of the human psyche. The collective unconscious was not a theory he invented. It was a reality he discovered by going mad in a controlled way, by descending voluntarily into the depths that psychotics fall into involuntarily, by maintaining consciousness in the face of overwhelming unconscious contents. The black books held the evidence. The red book would be the artistic elaboration. The collected works would be the scientific formulation. But the source was December 1913, the decisive step. The letting go, the fall into darkness, and the return with light. That is what happened inside Jung's mind in the first 24 hours after realizing the collective unconscious. Terror and revelation, madness and wisdom, death and rebirth, the oldest mystery of a human existence, played out in the psyche of a Swiss psychiatrist in a house on Lake Zurich. The numinous beginning which contained everything. And the evidence? It sits in bank vaults and archives. The black books were not published until 2020, 7 volumes of raw material. The red book was not published until 2009, nearly 50 years after Jung's death. His family kept it locked away. Why? Because Jung feared that people would think he was insane, that the visions would discredit his scientific work, that the art and the mythology would overshadow the psychology. He was probably right. But the visions were the foundation. Without December 1913, there is no analytical psychology. Without the descent, there is no collective unconscious. Without the terror, there is no individuation. Jung paid the price. He walked the edge, he came back, and he gave us a map of the psyche that we are still learning to read. 228 Seestrasse, Küsnacht, Switzerland, December 12th, 1913. A man closes his eyes and falls. The ground gives way. He lands in darkness. He sees a cave, a dwarf, a crystal, blood. He opens his eyes. He's at his desk. His family is in the house. The lake is outside his window. And inside his skull, the collective unconscious has announced itself, not as abstract theory, as lived reality. The most important moment in the history of depth psychology. And it began with one sentence. I let myself drop. But we are not done. The aftermath matters as much as the event. What did Jung do in the hours and days following that first descent? He did what any good scientist would do. He documented. The Black Book number 2 begins with the entry dated November 12th, 1913. But December 12th was when the intensity increased. The method became systematic. Every evening after his family went to sleep, Jung would sit at his desk and deliberately evoke the fantasies. He called this switching off consciousness. He wanted to see what would happen when the ego stepped aside. The unconscious rushed in to fill the vacuum. He recorded in meticulous detail, timestamps, locations within the psychic geography, dialogues transcribed as if they were court depositions. Jung was building evidence. He knew that subjective experience alone would not convince the scientific community. He needed patterns. He needed repetition. He needed to show that the same archetypes emerged independently in different contexts. His own psyche was the first laboratory. His patients would provide additional data, and world mythology would serve as the control group. If the same images appeared in his visions, in his patients, dreams, and in ancient religious texts from cultures that had no contact with each other, then the hypothesis was confirmed. The collective unconscious was real. The first 24 hours set the template. Descent, encounter with archetypal figures, dialogue, symbolic transformation, ascent, integration. This would become the structure of individuation, the process by which the individual's psyche realizes its full potential by integrating unconscious contents into consciousness. Jung did not invent this process. He discovered it happening spontaneously within himself. The confrontation with the unconscious was individuation in raw form, unrefined, dangerous, but authentic. Emma Jung's role in these first hours and days deserves attention. She was not merely the long-suffering wife. She was a trained mind. She would eventually become a Jungian analyst in her own right. She started her formal training in 1916, 3 years after her husband's first descent. She had already been interested in analytical psychology. She corresponded briefly with Freud in 1910 and 1911. She asked Freud about her husband's work and about psychoanalytic theory. She was not passive. When Jung began his confrontation with the unconscious, Emma watched with both concern and fascination. She later developed her own analytical practice and wrote scholarly works on the Grail legend. Jung encouraged her. He even forfeited his own interest in the Grail to leave that subject to her. Emma's book on the Grail was completed posthumously by Marie-Louise von Franz after Emma's death in 1955. But in December 1913, Emma was struggling. Her husband was slipping into a world she could not follow. Toni Wolff could accompany him because she had the same intuitive gifts and had undergone her own initiation. Emma was an introverted thinking type, like Jung himself. She was intellectual, rational, systematic. The mythological depths were not her native territory. She managed the household. She raised the children. She kept the external world stable while Jung explored the internal chaos. Without that stability, Jung might have lost his anchor entirely. As he later wrote, his family and his professional identity were the actual realities that reminded him he was a human being with responsibilities. They kept him from drowning in the unconscious. The lecture Jung gave to the Zurich Psychoanalytic Society on December 12, 1913, just hours after or before his first descent, was on the importance of the unconscious. The timing was uncanny. He was publicly speaking about the unconscious while privately plunging into it. This was synchronicity again. The outer event and the inner event aligned. Jung was living the subject matter of his lecture. The audience had no idea that the speaker was simultaneously experiencing what he described. This double life would characterize the entire confrontation period: public respectability and private madness, professional competence and psychological chaos, day life and night life. The visions of October 1913 had prepared him: the blood floods, the seas turning red, the drowned bodies of uncounted thousands. At first, Jung thought these were warnings of personal psychosis. Later, he understood them as premonitions of collective catastrophe. World War I erupted in August 1914. Millions would die. Europe would drown in blood exactly as Jung had foreseen. The collective unconscious had spoken through him. His personal visions were actually transpersonal. The archetypes were activated not just in him, but in the entire European psyche. War was the collective descent, mass psychosis on a continental scale. Jung's personal crisis mirrored the collective crisis. The microcosm reflected the macrocosm. This realization came slowly. In the first 24 hours after December 12th, Jung thought he might be going insane. By August 1914, he understood he had been sensing the archetypal currents that would erupt into world war. The collective unconscious does not respect individual boundaries. It moves through individuals. Poets, prophets, and psychotics are more permeable to its contents. Jung was all three in December 1913. A poet creating the Red Book. A prophet sensing the coming catastrophe. A psychotic descending into mythological depths. And somehow also a scientist recording everything for future analysis. The significance of December 12th, 1913, extends beyond Jung's personal biography. It marks the birth of a psychological paradigm that challenged the dominant view of the psyche as merely individual. Freud had opened the door to the unconscious in 1900 with the interpretation of dreams. Jung pushed through that door into a chamber Freud refused to enter. The collective unconscious, the archetypal realm, the transpersonal psyche. Freud remained focused on the personal and sexual. Jung went deeper and broader. He asked not just what was repressed in the individual, but what was inherited by the species. The first 24 hours were the crossing of a threshold. Jung passed from psychoanalyst to analytical psychologist, from disciple to pioneer, from theorist to explorer. He would spend the rest of his life mapping the territory he discovered in those initial descents, the archetypes, the collective unconscious, the process of individuation, the symbols of transformation, active imagination, dream analysis as dialogue with the unconscious. The concepts that now bear his name were all seeded in that period. December 1913 to 1917. 4 years of confrontation, 48 years of elaboration, and it began with one man sitting at his desk, closing his eyes, and letting himself fall into the unknown depths of his own mind. The evidence sits in archives, the black books in the Philemon Foundation collection. The Red Book, finally published in 2009 after languishing in a Swiss bank vault for decades, Jung's letters, the protocols of his seminars, the testimony of colleagues who knew him during those years, Barbara Hanna, Agnella Jaffe, Marie-Louise von Franz, they all attested to the reality of his experiences and the courage of his exploration. He was not performing for an audience. He was genuinely risking his sanity for knowledge, and he emerged with insights that continue to influence psychology, literature, religious studies, mythology, and popular culture over a century later. December 12th, 1913, Küsnacht, Switzerland. A psychiatrist lets himself drop. He falls into darkness. He meets prophets and dancers and serpents. He speaks with autonomous psychic entities. He watches his head become a lion. He is told he is Christ. He paints kingfisher wings and finds a dead kingfisher in his garden. He records everything. He returns to his desk. His family sleeps. The lake is still. And the collective unconscious has revealed itself to a human mind willing to look into the abyss without flinching. That is the story of the first 24 hours. Terror and transcendence, madness and method, the numinous beginning which contained everything. And the receipt is written in Jung's own hand, dated December 12th, 1913. In the book of my most difficult experiments,